Tripoli. Richard, what are you seeing and what are you hearing?
Savannah, I am inside Gadhafi's compound. It is filled now with thousands of rebels. They are looting the compound as we speak. They apparently broke into an armory. They are carrying armloads away of weapons. Trucks are full of weapons. They are towing out some of the expensive vehicles that were in here. They are tearing down emblems that were attached to buildings and pulling down every possible thing that they can find in this compound. No word yet if Gadhafi himself was in here. Instead, all we are hearing is celebratory gunfire and watching a steady stream of looters coming and going, celebrating and leaving this compound with everything they can carry.
Richard, I know the biggest question right now is where is Gadhafi? There have been conflicting reports about whether he's still in Libya. What's the latest you're hearing?
The rebels here, some of them are looking for Gadhafi. There is a bunker structure beneath this compound, so the hunt is still ongoing. We have not heard anything on the ground that he has been found. Instead, they are just going through this complex room to room, picking it apart, celebrating, taking what they can find, but so far they have not found Gadhafi.
It is certainly a fluid situation by definition, Richard. I know there was a time when rebel leaders were saying they had captured two of Gadhafi's sons, and yet we saw one of those sons, Saif al-Islam Gadhafi, show up at a hotel in Tripoli earlier today. What's the latest as far as the sons, where they are?
In Tripoli, things were looking very fluid. The rebels were celebrating a bit prematurely. They thought they had taken all of Tripoli, only to realize that there was still this heavily fortified compound still in the hands of loyalists. And then in the early morning hours, this assault began. It started with rockets, then it moved to anti-aircraft weapons, and then after the course of about 5 or 6 hours, the rebels were finally able to breach one hole in the outer perimeter wall. And then once that happened, there was intense fighting, almost hand-to-hand fighting inside this compound, and then just more rebels followed them, and now they've completely swarmed this complex and taken it over.
And Richard, I know you reported earlier there came a time when Gadhafi forces seemed to give up or stop fighting these rebel forces. Is that correct?
That is correct. About an hour ago, we stopped hearing gunfire coming out of this complex. All day there had been raging battle, rocket fire, anti-aircraft fire coming out. And then about an hour ago, silence. The first time we'd heard any kind of silence in the city for several days. And that silence remained only for about 10 or 15 minutes. People figured that the fighting may be over. More rebels rushed to the scene, and they streamed into that small gap in the wall and have now taken over the complex completely.
And Richard, to take a step back for a moment seems almost a foregone conclusion, but what does it mean that the rebels have captured this compound, both symbolically and strategically?
Strategically, this means that Tripoli has fallen. This was the last remaining holdout in Tripoli, and Gadhafi does have some supporters in other towns, particularly the town of Sirte. But this armed compound, and it was very heavily armed, was the thorn in the rebel side. They have now removed it. They now control almost all, if not all, of Tripoli. This is not just a symbolic victory, although it certainly is. This is a real victory because this compound was firing tank shells onto civilian areas up until a few hours ago. So now there may be some Gadhafi loyalists holed up in a few pockets, but nothing like they had experienced here. And you can probably hear in the background just some of the celebratory gunfire, which I am sure is going to be continuing through the evening, and then once it gets dark here, which should happen in the next hour or so.
Richard, many of our viewers, I'm sure, are curious what NATO's role has been as we've seen the fall of Tripoli, as you put it, obviously American forces involved in that NATO effort.
The NATO role has been very significant. The rebels would not be here if it were not for NATO. The rebels were failing. They almost lost this war. Benghazi was almost destroyed. Had NATO not come in, Gadhafi would have repressed this rebellion. The rebels fully admit that. Then the NATO helped turn the tide on the battle. Then it was up to the rebels to fight the ground fight. And even today, I think we saw that similar pattern being played out. The structure has been weakened many, many times over the course of months by NATO airstrikes. But ultimately, it was rebels, ground troops, that pushed in and fought through this very large, sprawling compound. They apparently used golf carts to move around in here, because I just saw some rebels driving off in one of Gadhafi's golf carts.
And Richard, what was the turning point? Because I think many people certainly were tuned into what was happening with Libya initially, particularly when the U.S. and NATO got involved. And then it seemed we saw kind of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back with regard to rebels gaining territory. And now here we are with the fall of Tripoli at this historic moment. What was the turning point that enabled rebels to make this final assault on the capital city?
The tipping point was when the rebels took a town called Zawiya. Zawiya is about 50 kilometers or 30 miles outside of Tripoli. Once the rebels secured a major base that close to the capital, they were able to accumulate in strength. And then the ultimate decision just came a couple of days ago, and the rebels decided face to face that they would march on Tripoli, and by the thousands they walked into the city, some drove into the city, and there was resistance along the way. But when this wave of rebels and this wave of civilians who joined the march to Tripoli arrived at the city gates, the resistance melted away. They were able to capture almost all of Tripoli, and today it seems they have captured the rest.
And you have been there several days now, Richard. What has been the reaction of the residents of Tripoli, who have been obviously in this Gadhafi stronghold all these months, watching as the rebel forces closed in?
I think they have been watching like we have been watching. They were celebrating when they thought that Tripoli had fallen. Then they were frightened when they realized that this small compound in the middle, almost like a fortified castle, was continuing to fire artillery shells and tanks into civilian areas. And once again, they are celebrating tonight that their city is free from the remnants of Gadhafi. A lot of people want to know what will happen with Gadhafi himself, and I assume that and forming a new government will be the biggest questions on their minds after the looting in this compound and tonight's celebrations end.
Richard, you are inside the compound as we speak, and we have a live picture of that compound. We see black smoke rising up, big clouds of black smoke. Do you have any idea what that might be from?
From where I am, no, I don't have a good perspective on what that black smoke is. I am by one of the main gates that the rebels have been using to bring in fighters, to take out supplies. We have just been here for about 30, 40 minutes, so I have not had a chance to see what the black smoke is. But there were many fires. At one stage, there was a swath of black smoke across the sky that stretched for several miles. This compound was designed as a last stand facility. It was full of weapons, it was full of food, it was full of fuel, and some of that fuel apparently was burning, but I haven't been able to determine where exactly it was.
And as we understand it, this compound, which is enormous, Richard, was so heavily fortified, it was fortress-like. It must be surreal for you and certainly civilians and rebel forces to be standing there on that ground as we speak.
This was a forbidden city. No Libyans were allowed inside here, and it was built as a fortress. I am looking at one of the walls surrounding it. It is 20 feet high, approximately, perhaps 2 feet thick, and within every other panel of the wall is a small cutout window that fighters could use to defend it. You could put a rifle through the wall and fight as people tried to approach it. So it was clearly designed for a siege, and a siege that took place today, but the defenses were clearly not enough.
Well, I guess the question now is, number one, where is Gadhafi? And number two, what next? We know that Libya has a tribal system, that Gadhafi ruled largely based on that, perhaps pitting one tribe against another. The question now is, can this group of tribes, these divisive factions, come together and form a union?
It's a difficult question. I think so far we haven't seen any signs of civil war. They don't have a ethnic divide. There's not a Sunni-Shiite split here. This is a country that is tribal. There are dozens, perhaps 100 tribes. But this could even be a unifying experience for many Libyans. So I think at this stage, based on what we've seen during the course of the revolution, there is reason to be optimistic that they will not turn on each other. Although that still is a possibility when resources become available. This is an oil-rich country. When billions of dollars of frozen assets start being released, undoubtedly lives will be lost in the fight over that. But whether this will descend into a civil war, it's probably too early to tell, but it seems unlikely.
And Richard, we want to tell our viewers what they're seeing on their screen. These are pictures from inside the compound, and you see civilians and rebels looting. They're climbing some of the what appear to be statues inside that compound, stepping on the head of what I'm looking at right now appears to be an image of Gadhafi himself, a golden image, and someone has their foot upon it and they're kicking it. Richard, for those who are just joining us, you are live in Tripoli inside Gadhafi's compound that once was a fortress and now has fallen to the rebels. Just describe what you're seeing and hearing at this historic moment.
We are seeing rebels storming in. They have just found the bodies of some foreign fighters. This area had been filled at one stage with mercenaries, most of them from sub-Saharan African countries. The rebels are going through. Primarily, they are looting this complex. They seem to have gotten into a weapons depot, and I'm watching a man walk right in front of me. He has two submachine guns, one in each hand, and another two automatic rifles slung over his shoulder. There is another truck in front of him full of rebels, all of them carrying new weapons taken from inside. We saw people carrying television sets, towing out vehicles. So they are taking away an incredible amount of weaponry from inside this complex. They're also firing guns in the air. There's some ambulances coming through now. Mostly it's a celebration. A rebel is now just coming up and shaking my hand. So it is a scene that is, we're taking pictures of these images, and you will see them later on Nightly News.
And Richard, does Gadhafi have any core of support in Tripoli, or was this a situation where his iron...
And you've been watching their history in the making, really. A special report from NBC featuring Richard Engel, actually inside the compound of Moammar Gadhafi in Tripoli. Rebel forces have taken control of Gadhafi's compound. They've taken control of a very large cache, a very large arsenal of weapons there, a very symbolic moment, if you will, symbolizing the end of this regime. Still, though, no word on Gadhafi's whereabouts. But as soon as we get word of that, either his capture or his sighting in Libya, we'll certainly break back in and let you know.
Of course.